welcome to another episode of the Business of AI podcast. And I'm delighted to welcome Adam Hadley, who's the CEO of Quantspark, to this episode. So Adam, great to have you. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Tim. Great to be invited on.
And I'm looking forward to finding out more around Quantspark and your background and how you ended up doing what you're doing today. So I wonder whether you could just give us a little bit of your history and how you ended up doing Quantspark.
Well, that's a great question. So I had a pretty eclectic decade or so in my 20s, working in strategy consultancy, being a CTO of a few startups, and also various academic endeavors. And I was always interested in the overlap between traditional consulting, data science, and software development. And I suppose in my late 20s, I was doing a fair amount of freelance data science work. And I then grew that into Quantspark. I grew Quantspark organically, and it's been bootstrapped for the last 12 years.
Amazing. So you've really been at the cutting edge there of seeing how to leverage technology in those startups and building and growing and seeing how that works. I think one of the things that I noted was quite interesting about what Quantspark are doing is the way you're approaching this question around productivity. Because it's one of the words that we hear so much when it comes to AI, and it is exciting, right? We know that AI-powered tools and services are going to transform productivity. I was talking with some civil servants the other day, and it's one of the mandates within the civil service to increase productivity through adopting AI, which is great. And obviously, it's something which has been happening in the private sector for many years now as well. You've really been at the cutting edge of understanding how to implement that productivity. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how do you start sort of planning to increase productivity? What should the first things be that you do?
Well, over the years, I think what I've learned is that by diving into the technical elements of what you want to do too early, sometimes you can miss the wood for the trees. And often what I advocate for is trying to understand what that organization is trying to achieve. It could be a government department, it could be a company, big or small. So productivity for me is, yes, it's a practical thing, but it also relies on an understanding what the organization is trying to do. What are the outcomes that it's trying to achieve? And how is it making decisions to support those objectives, and what information or data is available to do that? So what we often do at Quantspark is just step back almost completely from the data, from data science and from AI, and think, well, actually, what is the business model? What is the operating model? And it's in that context that we think about productivity. As I'm sure you and many of your listeners have had to think about many times, is this concept of return on investment, ROI. How can you measure the return on investment? Well, it's obviously very hard to do that in general, unless there are a number of specific circumstances in which you can control for improvements in whatever processes you're looking at. But this concept of ROI is important, but it only really makes sense if you understand what the organization is trying to achieve. And that's really how I think about productivity. What are you trying to achieve? And what investment are you making in terms of time and people to achieve that?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the right way to frame things, because so many times we hear of organizations, whether they be public sector or private sector, that have leapt into adopting AI, in quotation marks, without understanding what AI is, which bit of the technology stack they actually need, and more importantly, to your point, understanding the problem that they're trying to solve. And it's putting the cart before the horse, really, because they then end up having this technology in place that hasn't really been designed to address the business need, which is what they might be something which is relatively simple, but they race into adopting this this sort of unnecessarily complex solution, and it fails, and that then undermines a bunch of goodwill and trust within the organization. So I wanted to kind of understand, you've got a concept called linear thinking, and you talk quite a lot around the sort of the concept of being able to increase productivity at orders of magnitude. So how do you analyze the way in which productivity can be increased?
Well, I think critical to that is defining what we mean by productivity, and just going to the kind of linear thinking point of view in terms of ROI and productivity. I mean, not wanting to make a political point about pens. Productivity. If you think about pens, right, you could say, going from a pencil to a pen might improve productivity. Going from a pen to a typewriter to a Word document. That's what I mean by linear thinking. And a lot of the conversation about AI, even if we can agree what we mean by AI, I slightly wince whenever people talk about AI, because it could mean anything. But the linear thinking about productivity is often just thinking about the kind of going from one technology to another and it being better somehow, without thinking of the broader strategic context of how that technology is being used to achieve the outcomes that we were talking about just now. So when we're talking about this issue, especially with an organization, what I'm often interested to learn more about is how that organization operates. What's its hierarchy? How does information flow around that organization? And we know, of course, that I'm quite hostile to the concept of corporates, never having worked in one. And as you might imagine, as an entrepreneur, there's something about me that kind of, in some ways, I resist that corporate mentality where you have potentially hundreds of interconnections of people talking to one another about what they're doing instead of actually doing something. And productivity in that context, to me, is thinking about what is an organization trying to achieve, what are the outcomes, and how is it organizing itself. And it's in that context, I think AI, in particular, obviously, generative AI and agentic AI presents so much promise. Because if we can really be clear about what the organization is hoping to achieve, and we're clear about what processes ideally it needs to follow, then we can consider, well, do we need people to do this, or can agentic workflows support this? So this is for me, not about the technology at all. It's not really about the data. It's about the flow of decisions through an organization and the clarity that's required before you embark on any tech-driven or AI-driven transformation program. I mean, Tim, your point about transformation failures. I mean, you're so right. Most transformation fails because people don't think enough. People don't step back and try to understand what's going on and map it out. And the irony of all of this is that we have some of the most impressive information technologies available to us now in the history of humanity. But yet it still all comes down to the basics of business analysis and those traditional skills. And you alluded to a second one as well about getting buy-in, communicating effectively, making sure that people understand what the technology is and what it isn't. So there's an irony here that despite the sophistication of the technology that's available, we're still somewhat limited and constrained by our ability to really understand what the organization is doing and how to influence and encourage and support people through that journey.
Yeah, it's as you were talking there, it made me think that there's a difference between that sort of linear approach where you might bring in a new tool, and I always use PowerPoint or something like that as an example, right? You might come in and you might teach someone in your organization or a group of people in your organization a tool like PowerPoint, and then you see them adopt it over time. But what you're talking about in this instance is the organizational wide change. And as you started to talk, I saw sort of little nodes and edges. So like an organization wide change. And if you're able to bring all of those people on the journey, then it's not just that linear transformation, it's that sort of multiple node transformation, which obviously has increasing impact. But I think the challenge there is that when you're trying to drive that level of change in an organization, it becomes a human problem. And then you're really looking at how do you drive things like culture and mindset in order to address that. And that's actually, in some ways, a lot harder than just implementing the technology. So is that the sort of work that you're doing at Quantspark?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been working with large organizations, business and government departments for more than a decade now, helping them think through where they can productively focus on data solutions and AI and how they can implement it in practice, which is half about systems theory, half about design theory, I suppose, really, and the combination of system theory and design theory, as in thinking through what are the systems and how can you design those systems to support humans and how they would like to work. That's really what we're doing at Quantspark. So this applied AI transformation work. What we also do is build parallel systems. So there are some circumstances in which the huge amount of sort of transformation that's required might be really quite difficult for an organization to do. And instead, they may want to set up their own experiment, almost like an AI digital twin. So that's increasingly what we're doing as well. Often these two things in tandem. So how can we work with the management team and everyone in that business to reframe what their organization is doing? And also, how do we then build some experiments, some kind of parallel systems to see what opportunities there are to leapfrog some of this? Because ultimately, I suppose the question that we're trying to answer is, how can we enable your organization to prosper as a result of AI technologies? How can we help you defend against the inevitable disruption? Because I think there's also there's a degree of denial, actually, and maybe this is as a result of people being quite busy in their day jobs and not having the luxury of being able to follow the latest developments in applied AI. But there is a real sense now that existing large language models, the latest Claude model, or the latest OpenAI model, existing models are already so powerful. The challenge is not really the frontier technology, in my opinion. It's about how do we capture this opportunity in society, and how do we do so in a way that's inclusive and supports economic prosperity. Because I think we should be quite concerned that clearly human-led transformation is quite slow, it's quite painful. The technology is really roaring ahead, though. So that presents a big question, I think, for all of us, which is, to what extent are we prepared to invest in adapting, evolving organizations, and invest in all of the challenges that transformation entails, versus disrupting existing businesses or setting up a separate enterprise altogether? Because there are some existential challenges at the moment with AI, and none of them are about chemical or biological nuclear weapons. The existential challenges are really around economic disruption. And I think we haven't quite priced that into the economy yet.
Yeah, I'll come back to economic disruption in a minute, because that is a big topic in its own right. But I was interested by what you were saying there about the sort of levels of confidence in the sort of leaders and the organizations who are driving this, because we started off by talking around, how do we drive this adoption into organizations? How do we ensure that they are getting the people on board to drive that adoption? But then we were sort of talking around this sort of cutting edge and how fast things are moving quickly and developing, and all the new tools and all the power, all the things you could do with those new tools as well. But it struck me that there's quite a gap there, and the majority of businesses are probably struggling to even get started on the adoption journey. Very few businesses are actually really at that sort of bleeding edge of being able to leverage the technology and really do interesting new things. You're probably working more towards that sort of, there's more early adopters in those organizations. But I'd love to get your perspective on, from the companies that you've worked with, what's the balance? What sort of, how many people are sort of early adopters, and how many people are still struggling with the basics, and how has that shifted even over the last 6 months or so?
Well, I think it depends on the capital structure of the business, by which I mean who are the investors or senior stakeholders, and how much influence do they have over decision making? Because to a certain extent, I think, we in business, certainly in the UK, over the past decade, have gone through so many dramas and crises, haven't we, with COVID and so on and so forth. I think there's real sort of change fatigue, certainly in amongst the companies and businesses I know. So for the most part, I think people are just trying to figure out a way of growing their businesses in a quite a low growth environment. So the idea that AI is coming along and shaking all of our assumptions about what business is and how to grow and how to defend and so on, I think it's quite exhausting. But what we are seeing is that there's a cohort of businesses and government organisations as well who are accelerating away from everyone else. There's this sort of compounding gap, and that's the unique quality of technology, right? Because technology is always about compounding tools and the ability for things to agglomerate, I suppose, really. But that's a big topic in its own right. But we're actually seeing this compounding effect increase and increase and increase and increase. And therefore, it's not just the early adopters, but it's the people who are framing AI in the right way are gaining quite significant advantage over everyone else. So going back to what I was saying just now, I think we've all got to ask ourselves, is it worth our effort trying to persuade people of the basics, or should we focus on those organizations who already get it? And therefore already are far ahead of everyone else. And I think that's a real challenge in terms of how we focus our efforts. Tim, I don't know about you, with the work that you do, but I still often find having to persuade companies of the need to invest in this technology, still having to really advocate for the growth philosophy that I have with AI. Lawyers and accountants don't need to do this, but those of us working in AI do. And the reality is that there is actually quite limited appetite to invest in businesses. Many of the businesses we work with are private equity backed, which has some strengths and weaknesses. The strength is that you often have quite strong leadership and there's clear focus on growth. The drawbacks might be that there's quite a short investment life cycle. But in that context, what we're often saying is that AI should the opportunity and threat from AI needs to be evaluated rationally. So if you've invested £1 billion in businesses, the conversation should be, what is the opportunity and threat to that portfolio? And the answer is probably double-digit percentage, right? So if you've got $1 billion, £1 billion invested in businesses, the risk there is potentially hundreds of millions of pounds of your investment. But yet, if you go to a board, they're unlikely to be willing to pay more than £50,000 or £100,000 to do this. It goes back to what I was saying just now. There is this dissonance. There is this cognitive dissonance. And I think we're unable really to comprehend the sheer scale of transformation that AI is forcing upon us, because it's like nothing we've ever seen before. So in answering your question, which companies are doing better, which companies aren't embracing this? I think it all comes down to management quality. It comes down to strategic leadership. And whether we like it or not, even though there have been a huge number of pressures over the years on the business community, we have to embrace this technology, or our companies and organizations will wilt. So there isn't really a choice. And it will be interesting to see what level of creative disruption occurs over the next, let's say, 2 to 3 years as a result of this.
Yeah, you've painted quite a sort of a stark picture there, but I think it's necessary to make people realize the opportunities, but also the risks of not being on this journey and not investing in this. You've also touched upon the economics of this, and you've given some examples of companies where they have got the backing of their investors, and importantly, therefore, the board to be able to drive through this change. A lot of companies won't have that, and therefore they won't have the investment or the freedom to be able to invest in these tools. So is the only way for them to be able to drive this transformation and this sort of cultural change to be able to adjust the price that they're charging to the consumers? And it's back to the question we were talking about before in terms of the economics here, because actually what we're seeing is that there's this real demand for driving price down. When people talk about productivity and efficiency, they think it's going to reduce the price, but actually, in order to get to that efficiency, you need to invest something up front in order to build the systems to get that efficiency in the medium to long term. So how do you square those unit economics?
Really, really interesting. I think that productivity as a concept in economics is quite contested as well, right? I know a large management consultancy put a paper out a few months ago claiming that small companies were unproductive Whereas actually, I think it's the other way around. I think large companies are able to charge a lot for services just because they're large and they've got a kind of good brand and reputation. So we've got to be a bit careful when thinking about productivity, because obviously it depends largely on what revenue you're able to generate versus the cost inputs there. And not all of that is rational. A lot of that is down to the perception of value rather than the reality of it. But in terms of what we mean by productivity and efficiencies and scaling, I think that it's such a big topic, isn't it? I kind of how to think about this. I would say it really depends on your business model and the extent to which your business model is vulnerable to disruption or can seize the opportunity. I wouldn't say that my perspective, by the way, is particularly stark. It's only stark if people are in denial. I think actually for those people who think of AI more as a framing, more as a kind of philosophy without wanting to be too highfalutin about it, I think they'll really succeed. People who are thinking about businesses as systems, they'll succeed. But people who aren't thinking about businesses as systems or aren't thinking about their business model or their operating model probably will struggle to figure out how AI can fit into this. So I think it all comes down to the extent to which your business is vulnerable to disruption. How much of your business relies on information? And a conversation that I was having recently was thinking about regulation. So I think there are three types of businesses that are organizations. There are information businesses that are regulated, information businesses that are unregulated, and then there are all the physical kind of businesses and doing things. Now, to a certain extent, all information businesses will be largely replaced with AI over the next 5 to 10 years. Those that are regulated will probably be able to defend against this for the most part. So I think I would say if I was running a business and I'm really interested in the kind of long-term sustainability of that business, I would primarily be thinking about that business model and the extent to which it's relying on information to make decisions, and where that proprietary data is coming from, and the extent to which you can understand those processes. So I actually think this is a huge opportunity for the people who get this, because all of a sudden, you can take on competitors that you wouldn't have dreamt of competing with previously, because with AI, you can now build software so quickly, you can build tools so quickly, you can automate processes basically within the blink of an eye. So it's a huge opportunity for those of us who get it, and the rest of the economy might struggle, but that's the nature of capitalism.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the hard truths of an economy, is that there are many challenges, there are many cycles, and we are living through a revolution. I think you're right, we haven't really yet scratched the surface of the depth of this technology revolution. The examples are always made to compare it to the Industrial Revolution, but I think we're right at the beginning of that Industrial Revolution, the first steam engines, pumping water out of mines, that sort of level, rather than the sort of factories or the sort of railways age of it yet. And there is going to be a lot of disruption here. I mean, maybe we come back and do another podcast around the impact on jobs and work displacement and the effect that's going to have on labor, and therefore on the broader not just economy but on society. I think that's a whole topic in its own right. But I think it's really interesting what you say there about how it allows the smaller organizations to compete, because that is where, if you get it and you're switched onto it and you're willing to invest both the time and the money, then it can give you that sort of asymmetric advantage. I know that you're using quite a lot of AI tools within what you do. Could you give us a bit of an insight into how did you set those up and how you're using them, and how it gives you that sort of unfair advantage? Because that might help some of our audience to understand and inspire them to go and use it as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, there's a meme going around at the moment about addiction to Claude Code, and I think there's some truth to it. Although Codex, which is OpenAI's equivalent, is also very good. So yeah, I just think it's an absolute bonanza at the moment in terms of the ability to build tools that you could only have dreamt of a few years ago. And I have the privilege of working both to support our commercial clients, but also national security clients through an NGO that I run called Tech Against Terrorism. For Tech Against Terrorism, which is a small NGO, previously we'd have to fundraise millions of dollars to hire developers to build software. Without exaggeration, we can now build similar tools over a weekend for $500. So, I'm kind of, have seen myself through my own lived experience, it's possible to build something equivalent to $1 million worth of software, taking a year or more in one weekend. That's a factor of 1,000 or so. That is how mind-blowing this technology is. So what we're doing across the board at Quantspark as well is thinking about how we can build software to support processes, to enable our people to do what they're great at, which is engaging with other people, building rapport, understanding complex problems, being creative, and then gradually automating or augmenting all of the other processes that are a bit boring, that actually aren't uniquely valuable for our team. So what we're doing at Quantspark is thinking about exactly what I said. It'd be a bit pointless if I was just evangelizing for this without doing it ourselves. Thinking about, well, what does a consultancy actually do? What are the outcomes that Quantspark is trying to achieve here? And for that end, we're building what we're calling the Quantspark operating system, which is a platform that's about halfway built, that is supporting the end-to-end processes of our consultancy, from client acquisition, project initiation, project closure, all the marketing sorts of things as well. So we're building our own software platform that merges about 10 other software as a service solutions that we've previously used, and uses AI to do all of this as well. So one example of something I built last week, which I'm quite pleased about, but is actually quite simple, is using Claude Code to read my emails, to read all of the meeting transcripts, to extract all the actions, put them on a Trello board, do the same with Slack, and then every day send Slack messages to everyone, asking how the day has gone, asking how various projects are going, and then pulling it back into what I'm calling the CEO brain. That took half an hour to build. It's just, I think my team's a bit annoyed with me because now that I've now got an AI bot asking them how their day is and so on. But it just goes to show, what you can achieve by thinking this through at a systematic level. So we're really trying to push the edges of what's possible with especially with Claude Code and other solutions. And I must say, it's just, pretty much every day I have a oh my God moment. I cannot believe this is possible. I think that the struggle that we're all having, and I'd imagine many clients as well, is there's so much going on. It's so hard to keep up with it. And despite the, I would say, 1,000x productivity that Claude Code and other solutions can provide, you end up being busier as a result. Tim, I don't know about how you feel about this, but I've never felt busier despite having all of these tools available. I think it's because it's lowering the barrier to entry. You feel like you can do so much more, so then you do much more. But yeah, I think it's just so exciting. And I think those organizations that will embrace this positively and are prepared to put the work in to understand their processes, I think they'll come out on top. I think those large organizations that have long rested on their laurels in terms of being unproductive, but able to charge lots of money, I think they're kind of in trouble. So going back to what I was saying about productivity, I think there's, the report I was referencing about small companies being unproductive. I think we've got to be very careful here, because most large organizations I know appear to be productive because they're charging a lot for what they do. But actually, when you map and model what everyone is doing, they're mainly having meetings and talking to one another, and they're just able to charge a lot because they're a big brand. So I think those organizations that have a lot of middle management, a lot of people having meetings, talking about meetings, I think they're probably the ones where there's going to be a big opportunity. And I'm just hoping that investors realize this and can apply pressure on boards and senior management to apply AI in various ways. Because, whilst it may not have been a few months ago, possibly some of these technologies were imperfect. The rate of development of large language models now is such that I think pretty much everything I can do can be augmented or automated with AI. And if I think I can do that, I think that probably applies to many people.
There's some things, right, that are still human, which only you can do from your lived experience and from your intellectual ability and, all of those kind of human bits. But I agree, yeah, that there's a lot which you can now outsource, whether that be through the tools you mentioned there. And I think some of the advances we've seen, things like Clawbots, so going out, OpenClaw now, going out there, and even NVIDIA leaning into that with Nemo. I think there's all these kind of opportunities now to wire things together in a way, and it's almost like a hobbyist, isn't it? Like you referenced spending a few half an hours here and there trying to sort of wire it all together, but it's quite fun. It does have that sort of feel to it of being like a ham radio or early computer sort of enthusiast trying to build things together. The challenge I wanted to ask you about though was, we're seeing more and more of these solutions, whether it be to create the code or whether it be to wire things together in that automation example you gave there. And I'm conscious that, you're also kind of very aware within the terrorism space, the national security space, of some of the massive vulnerabilities and risks inherent if bad actors are able to get into these tech stacks. What I've heard and been discussing with a number of organizations is that there was this sort of rush to adopt agentic at the end of the year, beginning of this year, people trying things out. And then suddenly over the last month or so, there's been the sort of realization that there's a huge level of vulnerability there, that as people have gone in and built out these, whether it be agentic solutions or other solutions using these tools, they haven't really thought it through. And suddenly people are saying, you've got to think it through, think about the risks, think about where the vulnerabilities are, think about cyber, and things are starting to slow down there. So I wanted to ask you, when you're sort of creating, when you're using those tools, what's your perspective on the safety and the vulnerability there?
Yeah, I think this is so important to think of this in the round. First of all, the psychology of fear is important, I think, to know. And half of my career is focused on counterterrorism, and terrorism in some ways is a completely irrational fear. Many people die as a result of terrorism, but many more die from car crashes and heart attacks and so on and so forth. I mean, you get my point. So we have to be a little bit careful here. What I say to clients is that provided you're paying a reputable company and you're not using the free version of whatever AI they're providing, then it's probably okay if you're content with the cloud in the first place. So if you've got information on the cloud, using an AI where they've agreed not to train on your data is equivalent to this. There are no new risks associated with it. The second point is about permissions and privileges that you might give an agentic system. And I think what I was going to say earlier is that ultimately, I think what we're talking about here is delegation. When we think about productivity and AI enhancements and so on, I often ask clients, well, if I were to hire 100 very clever interns who had very little understanding of your industry, what would you do with them? And most people wouldn't have a clue, because they'd be like, I have no idea how to break down the problems. I have no idea how to communicate with them. I have no idea how to create all the feedback loops. How on earth will I manage these 100 interns? Well, actually, I think agentic AI is exactly the same problem. It's about delegation. So it's not only about governance and control and clarity of tasks and so on, and management by exception, all these sorts of things. It's also about permissions. If you were to give your 100 interns access to your bank account, access to your email account, well, you can imagine there's huge risk associated with that. So you've got to be thoughtful about it. And I think why would you give an agentic system more permissions than you would colleagues? Well, you might do, but you would probably put policies in place. You'd probably have ways of checking things and monitoring things. Why would it be any different with an agentic AI system? The final thing I would say, that I would be slightly cautious of the fearmongers. Now, Microsoft has won a lot of enterprise business as a result of saying it's hyper secure. Now, I'm sure it is, but that doesn't mean other things aren't. So I think that there is this sort of fear at the moment amongst many clients that they can't use AI because they're worried that their information will be stolen or their systems will be compromised. And actually, those risks have always been there. And provided your cybersecurity systems and processes are robust and are really strong, I don't think there's going to be any additional problem there. So I would encourage everyone to try to, I suppose, challenge some of the assumptions about security, because there often are vested interests in saying that they are more secure than everyone else. And that isn't necessarily the case. Having said that, there are risks. You do sometimes want to sandbox things. And there are fundamental challenges such as prompt injection, which many of your listeners might be familiar with. There are big problems. Yes, there are. However, there are risks in everything we do. And there's probably a much bigger risk in not engaging with this technology. There's probably a greater existential risk by ignoring this technology than there is embracing it and trying to mitigate any risk that comes from that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's we've been working with the government and various teams from the government who are now writing the codes of conduct, checklists, if you like, that businesses should go through when they are thinking about how they will bring AI into their existing tech stack. I think they've recognized the importance of setting that out and being very clear and creating some operating standards between countries that allow businesses to have that sort of almost view of what they need to do in order to have minimal security compliance, and that's quite important as well. So I think it's kind of trying to make sure that that keeps up with the developments in agentic and in these systems, and that's part of the work that some of our agentic businesses are helping feed into that, and will continue to do that as well. You touched upon there giving some advice to CTOs and CEOs who are sort of thinking about listening to this, and I wanted to sort of as we start to wrap things up, what would be your main advice to a leader who's listening to this, who's heard what you've said about productivity, heard what you've said around how they get started? What are the first steps, and what are the things they need to really be focusing on?
Well, counterintuitively, I'd say don't think about AI at all. Don't think about data at all. Don't think about technology at all. Try to, on one page, write a flowchart of what your business does and where you're making money, and where, crucially, you're adding value. Not making money necessarily, but adding value. That's the key thing to do. And from that should flow thinking about how your organization is structured, what the key processes are, and what information is associated with those processes and decisions. That actually is the key to all of this, in my view. It's nothing to do with the technology at all. So if you're able to really understand your operating model, your business model, and you are thoughtful about that, then I think you'll be very successful in this, in making the most of this AI revolution.
It's almost going back to that startup process, isn't it? I know we started off talking about your background and coming up through startups, and I remember going through that process of the business canvas, and the product market fit, and so really breaking it down into the real basics of what does your company actually do, how are you going to make money, and what are the component parts of doing that, and it's that's what startups have to go through in order to validate their business model, to get the investment and funding. Larger businesses maybe did that years ago, but you're almost saying they should go back to those fundamentals, really understand that before they can scale.
Well, and also I think, push back against people in your organization, because you're going to have lots of people who are defensive. Understandably, people don't want to lose their jobs. People are frightened of the disruption that will come from this. But it's not necessarily the case that people in your own organization really support the adoption of AI. So you've got this sort of insider risk, in the sense that not everyone in your organization is actually interested in the success of that organization. I'm not saying then not necessarily, but there is always that risk. So if you're able to focus on the fundamentals first, and then ask some thoughtful questions. We have a customer services team. Why could they be used for something else instead? Could they be adding value in another way? And I think the final thing I'd say here, because we are working with quite a few companies and thinking through how they can adapt to the AI revolution. And often what we say is that, if you've got parts of your business that are, kind of commoditizable, then automate it and move up the value chain. Do something that's more valuable for your customers or clients. So if your business historically was providing information about something, well, that can probably be automated for the most part, or augmented in various ways. So move up the value chain. What do your clients and customers value? And can your people focus more on that and less on the basic kind of information processing tasks? So that's really the opportunity, thinking about the value chain, I suppose, really, and going up the value chain. So it might be that you perhaps provided intelligence about, I don't know, the price of widgets or something. Instead of providing a database on that, you might want to think about why people need those widgets and what value that they're gathering from that. So I think the value chain is a good way of thinking about this as well. And going up the value chain, capturing more of that value, means that you can use AI in the right way, and you can essentially elevate your business in terms of generating value in a different way in the future.
Yeah. Great. I love that. I think that might be the title of this episode, which is leveraging AI to move your business up the value chain. I think that's a really powerful way of bringing everything together that we've been discussing. Just to wrap things up then, how can we find out more about Quantspark and stay in touch with the projects that you're working on?
Well, there's our website, quantspark.ai. We're also on LinkedIn and on X. So please search for us. We have a monthly AI newsletter as well. And we're also organising a series of webinars and in-person events in London. So yeah, it'd be great to hear from anyone who's interested. And Tim, thanks very much for inviting me on this podcast.
Yeah, well, Adam, it's been fascinating talking to you. We've covered a lot of ground. It's been really interesting to get your background and insight as an entrepreneur, now advising these businesses on going through those changes and how to actually sort of start to focus on the things that matter in the organization, framing the challenge and then sort of driving the productivity and efficiency off that, rather than just trying to do it for its own sake. And it really given us some great analogies there, great insights into how other businesses are doing it, and how do we ensure that we're keeping up with that massive pace of change, but also not forgetting about the basics and the fundamentally important things such as security. But yeah, I think the way we could framed it at the end there around moving up the value chain, that's really key, because that's what technology should be doing. It should be allowing us to do the bits which only humans can do, which humans are very good at, whilst getting rid of all those repetitive tasks, and that's where the automation can kick in. So really valuable. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.